Red Skull stood at the control panel, his expression twisted with triumph as the Valkyrie aircraft hurtled toward New York. Steve Rogers, battered but unyielding, fought with every ounce of strength he had left. The two men clashed in a brutal struggle, their fists and ideals colliding as the fate of millions hung in the balance. "You could have ruled the world, Rogers," the Red Skull sneered, raising the Tesseract. Its glow bathed the room in an unearthly blue light. But instead, you chose to play the soldier. Steve, bloodied but resolute, lunged forward, knocking the Tesseract from the Red Skull's grasp. The cube tumbled across the control panel, its energy pulsating wildly. Both men froze as it sparked with unstable power, its hum growing louder. Before Steve could react, the Tesseract flared, and a wave of light enveloped him. His body disintegrated into streaks of blue energy, leaving the Red Skull alone in the cockpit. Steve awoke with the start, his heart pounding as he gasped for air. The first thing he noticed was the heat, oppressive and dry, the air thick with sand. He sat up, shielding his eyes from the blinding twin suns overhead. The endless desert stretched out before him, its rolling dunes punctuated by jagged rock formations. "Where am I?" he muttered, his voice hoarse. Rising to his feet, Steve dusted off his uniform and surveyed the alien landscape. Strange creatures scurried across the sand, their forms unlike anything he had ever seen. A massive beast with leathery skin lumbered in the distance, its roar echoing across the desert. Steve instinctively reached for his shield, but it was gone. "Okay, Rogers," he said to himself, taking a steadying breath. "Figure this out, one step at a time." Hours passed. As Steve wandered aimlessly through the desert, his thoughts racing. He had no food, no water, and no idea how he had ended up in this strange place. The landscape was eerily silent, broken only by the occasional cry of alien birds. As night fell, the temperature plummeted. Steve found shelter in a small cave, nestled within a rocky outcrop. Exhausted, he sat against the cool stone wall, his thoughts drifting to the mission he had left behind. "I'll find a way back," he vowed quietly, his resolve unshaken. Somehow. The next morning, Steve ventured out of the cave, determined to find answers. The suns rose quickly, their heat scorching the sand beneath his boots. He spotted a trail of smoke on the horizon and set off toward it, his pace quickening with hope. After hours of walking, he arrived at a bustling settlement. The streets were lined with strange buildings made of sand-colored stone, and creatures of all shapes and sizes filled the market square. Steve's eyes widened as he took in the sight. This was no ordinary town. "What kind of place is this?" he muttered, his gaze darting from one alien to another. Steve's journey led him to a dimly lit bar, the hum of conversation and clinking glasses spilling out onto the street. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. The patrons, a mix of humans and otherworldly beings. Steve hesitated at the entrance, his instincts warning him to stay alert. At the bar, a young man with sandy blonde hair stood nervously, his back pressed against the counter. Two large aliens loomed over him, their guttural language incomprehensible, but clearly threatening. "I don't want any trouble," the young man said, his voice shaky. "Just let me go." The larger alien sneered and shoved him to the ground. Steve stepped forward instinctively, his voice cutting through the din. "Hey, back off." The room fell silent as all eyes turned to Steve. The aliens growled, sizing him up. "Who are you to interfere?" one of them snarled. "Just someone who doesn't like bullies," Steve replied evenly. The aliens lunged, but Steve was ready. He ducked under the first swing, landing a clean punch that sent the smaller alien sprawling. Grabbing a nearby stool, he deflected the second attacker's blow, before delivering a powerful kick that knocked him back. As the dust settled, the young man scrambled to his feet, his eyes wide with gratitude. "Thanks," he said, brushing sand from his tunic. "I didn't think anyone would step in." "Glad I could help," Steve said, extending a hand. "Name's Steve Rogers." "Luke Skywalker," the young man replied, shaking his hand. Before Steve could process the unusual name, an older man in a brown robe approached, his piercing blue eyes studying Steve intently. "You fought well," he said, his voice calm. "You're not from around here, are you?" "No," Steve admitted. "I'm just trying to figure out where here is." The older man smiled faintly. "I'm Ben Kenobi, and I believe you found yourself in a most unusual situation." As Steve followed Ben and Luke to a secluded corner of the bar, he was introduced to two more companions, a rugged man named Han Solo and his towering Wookiee co-pilot, Chewbacca. Han eyed Steve skeptically, his hand resting on his blaster. "What's your story, pal?" Han asked. "You don't look like you're from any planet I've ever been to." Steve hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I'm from a different place. A different time, maybe. All I know is I have to find a way back." Ben leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "The Force brought you here for a reason. I sense great strength in you, Steve Rogers. Perhaps your path is not to return, but to stay and fight." "Fight what?" Steve asked. "The Empire," Luke said. "We're part of the Rebel Alliance. We're trying to stop them." Steve's mind raced as the group explained the galaxy's plight, the rise of the Empire, the destruction it had wrought, and the rebellion's desperate struggle for freedom. Though the details were foreign, the core of the story resonated deeply with Steve. "Evil is evil," he said finally. "It doesn't matter what world it's on. If I can help, I will." Ben nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Then, perhaps you were brought here for a purpose, Captain." The Millennium Falcon soared through the vastness of space, its interior buzzing with activity. Steve Rogers sat at the holotable, absorbing the whirlwind of information about the galaxy, the Rebel Alliance, and the oppressive rule of the Empire. Luke Skywalker, still energized from their encounter in the bar, eagerly explained the rebellion's goals. "They control everything," Luke said, gesturing toward a holographic map of the galaxy. "Planets, resources, people's lives. The Empire crushes anyone who resists." Steve leaned forward, his jaw tightening. "And the Alliance? How many are fighting back?" "Not enough," Han Solo interjected from the cockpit, his tone laced with skepticism. "But don't get your hopes up, Cap. The rebellion's a mess. A ragtag group with blasters trying to take on an empire with Star Destroyers and Death Stars." "Every fight starts small," Steve said evenly. "It's about standing for what's right, no matter the odds." Han smirked. "Sure, pal. Let me know how that works out for you." As the Falcon approached Yavin 4, the hidden base of the Rebel Alliance, Ben Kenobi sat beside Steve. The older man studied him, his piercing gaze seeming to see beyond the surface. "You carry the weight of a soldier," Ben said. "But your journey is not just one of battle. The Force surrounds you, Captain Rogers." Steve frowned. "The Force?" "A binding energy," Ben explained. "It flows through all living things. I sense great resolve in you, but also confusion. You seek purpose, but you've already found it." Steve's thoughts drifted to the mission he had left behind, his comrades, and the uncertainty of his current path. "I'm not sure I belong here," he admitted, "but if I can help, I will." Ben placed a reassuring hand on Steve's shoulder. Perhaps you were brought here to lead. The Falcon landed at the rebel base, where Steve was greeted by a bustling crowd of soldiers, technicians, and pilots. The atmosphere was one of determination mixed with desperation. These were people fighting against overwhelming odds, clinging to hope. General Yan Dodonna approached, his sharp eyes assessing Steve. "So, you're the one Kenobi's been talking about," he said. "A soldier from another world." Steve nodded. "I'm here to help." "Good," Dodonna said, "because we need all the help we can get." Steve was quickly introduced to the challenges facing the rebellion. The Empire had learned of the base's location and was preparing an attack. The rebels were outnumbered and outgunned, with only a slim chance of survival. "We need to evacuate," a young officer argued during a strategy meeting. "We can't hold off an entire fleet." "And if we run, the Empire will hunt us down," Dodonna countered. "We need to make a stand." Steve listened carefully, his mind racing as he absorbed the situation. Finally, he spoke. "What about creating a diversion? Split their forces, draw them away from the base." Dodonna raised an eyebrow. "A diversion?" Steve stood, his voice steady. "I've seen it work before. If we can hit them where they don't expect it, we might buy enough time for the evacuation." Han leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. "Great plan, Cap. Who's volunteering for that suicide mission?" Steve met his gaze without hesitation. "I am." The room fell silent. Luke stepped forward, his expression resolute. "I'll go with you." "You'll need a pilot," Han said, though his tone was begrudging. "And someone to keep this bucket of bolts running." Chewbacca growled in agreement. Steve looked to Ben, who nodded. "The Force will be with you." The plan was set. Steve, Luke, Han, and Chewbacca would lead the diversionary strike, targeting an Imperial supply depot to draw attention away from the base. As the Falcon lifted off, Steve felt a familiar sense of purpose. This was a mission he could lead, a chance to make a difference. The supply depot loomed on the horizon, its towering spires bristling with Imperial defenses. As the Falcon approached, TIE fighters scrambled to intercept them. Han piloted, with precision, weaving through enemy fire as Chewbacca manned the guns. "Hang on back there," Han shouted, as the ship jolted from an explosion. Steve and Luke prepared to disembark, their gear ready. "You sure about this?" Luke asked, his nerves evident. "I've done crazier," Steve said with a faint smile. "Stick with me and we'll get through this." The team infiltrated the depot, their movements swift and coordinated. Steve's leadership was evident as he directed their actions, using his tactical experience to outmaneuver the Imperial forces. Luke marveled at his courage, his admiration for the soldier from another world growing with each passing moment. Steve's shield, improvised from a reinforced piece of metal, became an invaluable tool, deflecting blaster bolts and incapacitating stormtroopers with precise throws. "You're pretty good with that thing," Han remarked as he blasted a trooper. "Maybe you do belong here." As the team planted explosives throughout the depot, an alarm blared. Reinforcements were on their way. Steve rallied the group, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Stay focused," he called out. "We're almost there." The team fought their way back to the Falcon, the depot erupting in flames behind them. As they lifted off, Steve looked back at the destruction they had caused. It was a small victory, but one that bought the rebellion precious time. Back at the rebel base, the diversion allowed for a successful evacuation. Dodonna met Steve with a firm handshake. "You've done more for us in a day than some have in years," he said. Steve nodded. "It's not about what I've done. It's about what we can do together." Ben approached, his expression thoughtful. "You're a natural leader, Captain. The rebellion could use someone like you." Steve glanced at Luke, Han, and the others. For the first time since his arrival, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. "Then let's win this." The Millennium Falcon hung silently in space, hidden within an asteroid field, as the Rebel Alliance regrouped after their narrow escape from Yavin 4. On board, Steve Rogers stood with General Dodonna and Ben Kenobi around a holographic display, planning their next move. "The Empire won't ignore what we've done," Steve said, his tone measured but resolute. "They'll come after us harder than before." Dodonna nodded. "They've already begun tightening their grip on nearby systems. We're receiving distress calls from allies across the Outer Rim." Steve clenched his fists. "Then we hit them again. Harder." Ben placed a hand on Steve's shoulder. "Patience, Captain. The Empire is vast, and its resources are nearly limitless. If we rush into battle, we may lose more than we gain." Steve hesitated, but Ben's calm presence reminded him of the importance of strategy over brute force. "What's our best target?" Luke Skywalker, standing nearby, stepped forward. "We've intercepted communications about a key Imperial facility on the forest moon of Endor. It's heavily guarded, but if we can take it out, we could cripple their supply chain." Han Solo leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Endor, huh? Sounds like a death trap." Chewbacca growled in agreement. Steve glanced at the group, his determination unwavering. "Then we make it our trap." The mission to Endor was risky, but the rebels knew the importance of striking a decisive blow. Steve, Luke, Han, Chewbacca, and a small team of commandos prepared to infiltrate the facility. As the Falcon approached the moon, its dense forest canopy stretched endlessly below them. "We'll drop you here," Han said, pointing to a clearing on the map. "Stay quiet, stay fast. You don't want to wake the locals, or the Empire." Steve smirked faintly. "We'll manage." The team moved through the dense forest, their movements silent as they approached the Imperial facility. The towering structure loomed ahead, its stark metal design a stark contrast to the natural beauty around it. Steve led the group, his shield slung across his back. "Remember, our goal is to destroy their communications relay. If we cut them off, they won't be able to call for reinforcements." Luke nodded, his lightsaber ready at his side. "What if we run into trouble?" "We handle it," Steve said simply, "and we don't leave anyone behind." The first part of the mission went smoothly. The team infiltrated the facility using Luke's Jedi abilities to evade detection. Steve's tactical expertise guided them through the maze of corridors, avoiding patrols and security cameras. Inside the relay room, Han and Chewbacca worked quickly to plant explosives while Steve and Luke kept watch. "This is almost too easy," Han muttered, his fingers flying over the controls. "Don't jinx it," Steve said, his senses on high alert. As if on cue, alarms blared. Stormtroopers poured into the facility, their blasters firing. Steve raised his shield, deflecting the bolts as the team scrambled to complete the mission. "Time to move," Steve shouted, covering the team as they retreated. The escape was chaotic. The rebels fought their way through waves of stormtroopers, the forest erupting into a firefight. Steve's shield became a blur as he protected his teammates, his movements precise and unyielding. Luke ignited his lightsaber, cutting through enemy forces with a skill that left even Steve in awe. "You weren't kidding about that thing," Steve said, nodding to the glowing blade. "Comes in handy," Luke replied with a grin. The team reached the extraction point, but their escape was blocked by an Imperial AT-ST Walker. Its massive frame loomed over them, its cannons swiveling toward the group. "Leave this to me," Steve said, sprinting forward. "Steve, wait!" Luke called, but it was too late. Steve charged the walker, using his shield to deflect its initial blasts. He climbed onto its legs, scaling the mechanical behemoth with sheer determination. Reaching the cockpit, he pried open the hatch and threw a grenade inside, leaping clear as the walker exploded in a fiery burst. Back on the Falcon, the team watched as the facility detonated in the distance. The destruction lit up the night sky, a beacon of hope for the rebellion. "You're insane, Rogers," Han said, shaking his head. "But I'll give you this. You get results." Steve smiled faintly, exhaustion evident in his eyes. "We all did our part." As the team returned to the rebel fleet, celebrations were tempered by the knowledge that the Empire would retaliate. Steve met with Dodonna and Ben to discuss the next steps. "The Empire's fleet will descend on us soon," Dodonna said. "We've dealt them a blow, but it won't stop them." Steve looked to Ben, his expression firm. "We need to unify the rebellion. If we don't stand together now, we might not get another chance." Ben nodded. "You've inspired them, Captain. Your leadership has given the rebels hope." Steve glanced at the fleet, a mix of patched up ships and weary fighters. "Hope's a start," he said. "Now we turn it into victory." The rebel fleet gathered in orbit around a distant moon, their ships forming a ragtag armada against the oppressive might of the Empire. On the bridge of the lead ship, Steve Rogers stood with General Dodonna, Ben Kenobi, and Luke Skywalker, reviewing the tactical display of their next and most critical mission. "The Empire's fleet is amassing near the Death Star," Dodonna explained, his voice steady but grim. "If we're going to stand a chance, we need to hit them hard and fast before they can organize." Steve studied the display, his expression focused. "What's the plan?" Luke pointed to a weak point in the Death Star's structure. "We've identified a thermal exhaust port. A precise strike here will trigger a chain reaction, destroying the entire station." Steve frowned. "That's a long shot." "It's the only shot we've got," Han interjected, leaning against the table. "Unless you've got a better idea, Cap." Steve didn't flinch. "If we're going to do this, we need everyone working together. We hit the Death Star, but we also need to keep their fleet off our backs. That means splitting our forces, half to distract their fleet, the other half to cover the attack run." Dodonna nodded. "It's risky, but it could work." Ben placed a hand on Steve's shoulder. "The Force will guide us." The rebels prepared for battle, the atmosphere aboard the fleet buzzing with nervous energy. Steve walked through the hangar, offering words of encouragement to the pilots and soldiers. His presence inspired confidence, his unwavering determination contagious. Luke approached, adjusting his flight suit. "You really believe we can do this?" Steve smiled faintly. "I've seen impossible odds before, Luke. It's not about the chances, it's about standing for what's right." Han sauntered over, his trademark smirk in place. "Well, if we're all about to die, at least we'll do it in style. The Falcon's ready to go." Steve clapped him on the back. "Good, let's make it count." The rebel fleet emerged from hyperspace, the massive silhouette of the Death Star looming ahead. The Empire's fleet awaited them. A wall of Star Destroyers and TIE fighters. Alarms blared as the battle began. Steve took command of the distraction force, leading a squadron of X-Wings and Y-Wings into the heart of the Imperial fleet. "Stay in formation," he ordered over the comms. "We need to keep them focused on us." TIE fighters swarmed around them, their green laser bolts filling the void of space. Steve's tactical brilliance shone as he directed the squadron, orchestrating coordinated attacks that kept the Imperial fleet off balance. Meanwhile, Luke, Han, and Chewbacca led the attack run on the Death Star. The trench run was a harrowing gauntlet, turbo lasers and enemy fighters firing relentlessly. Han piloted the Falcon with incredible skill, weaving through the chaos as Chewbacca manned the guns. "We've got fighters on our tail," Luke shouted. "I see him, kid," Han replied, banking hard to avoid a burst of laser fire. "Just keep your eye on the target." Back in the main battle, Steve's squadron suffered heavy losses, but their efforts kept the Imperial fleet from regrouping. An Imperial Star Destroyer loomed ahead, its massive guns targeting the Rebel flagship. "Rogers, what are you doing?" Dodonna's voice crackled over the comms as Steve's X-Wing broke formation. "Buying us more time," Steve replied, his tone calm. He piloted his ship straight toward the destroyer, narrowly avoiding its turbo lasers as he unleashed a barrage of proton torpedoes. The destroyer's shields buckled, and its weapons went offline, giving the rebels a critical advantage. Inside the Death Star's trench, Luke neared the exhaust port. His targeting computer beeped as he lined up the shot, but doubt clouded his mind. The TIE fighters pursuing him grew closer, their lasers striking the Falcon as Han and Chewbacca fought to protect him. "Trust the Force," Ben's voice echoed in Luke's mind. Taking a deep breath, Luke deactivated the targeting computer. "I've got this," he said quietly. Steve, listening over the comms, recognized the resolve in Luke's voice. "Take the shot, Luke," he urged. With steady hands, Luke fired the proton torpedoes. The glowing projectiles disappeared into the exhaust port, and for a moment, there was silence. Then a massive explosion rocked the Death Star, its surface erupting in flames. The station disintegrated, sending shockwaves through space. The Imperial fleet, disoriented by the loss of their superweapon, began to retreat. Cheers erupted across the Rebel fleet as the Death Star's destruction signaled a turning point in their struggle. Back aboard the Falcon, Luke sat back in his seat, his face a mixture of relief and disbelief. "We did it," he whispered. Han grinned. "Yeah, kid, we did." The Rebel fleet regrouped and the surviving soldiers and pilots returned to their base. Steve stood before the gathered crowd, his presence commanding as he addressed the rebels. "Today we proved that no force, no matter how powerful, can crush the spirit of those who fight for freedom," he said. "The Empire isn't defeated yet, but this is a start. Together we can finish what we've begun." The crowd erupted into cheers, their spirits lifted by Steve's words. As the rebels celebrated, Steve found a quiet moment with Ben Kenobi. "You've done well," Ben said. "The Force flows strongly through you." Steve shook his head with a faint smile. "I don't know about that, but I'll keep fighting." Ben nodded. "You were brought here for a reason, Captain, and your journey is far from over." Steve looked to the stars, his heart filled with a sense of purpose. He didn't know what the future held, but he was ready to face it, one battle at a time.